All right, what's going on, everyone? I read as many comments as I can. Of course, I miss a lot, but I think it's a great way to sort of see trends of what people are thinking or pick out certain items that are maybe causing confusion or concern around a specific topic. And in comments here in my videos, as well as videos by other creators, I'm seeing more and more around the thought of a pending Russian attack sometime in the near future in Ukraine. I'm not talking about little pushes at Bakhmut or minor gains elsewhere along the front, but the idea that the biggest offensive action since the start of the war is in the making. Now, before diving in, I want to lead with I don't know if this is about to happen or not. It's not obvious that it's in the works, but then again, any offensive would rightly be hidden from public view. So rather than trying to predict if that's going to happen, let's take a look at some of the reasons behind why that could play out, challenges Russia may run up against, and where it might occur. All right, things have changed a bit on the Russian side when General Surovikin took charge in October. He was appointed after a pair of Ukrainian counteroffensive kicked off in September that saw Russia pushed out of Kharkiv in a rather surprising fashion. As a reminder, talk of an offensive in Kherson had been going on for weeks, if not months. And then when it did eventually kick off, all eyes were in the south. And shortly thereafter, Ukraine seems to have found an exposed, undermanned area of the Russian lines near Kharkiv, and it was essentially a rout. The few Russian troops who were there fled, and Ukraine ended up pushing something like 40 plus miles as successive Russian units retreated rather than being cut off and surrounded. It was one of the few quick victories by either side that we've seen in this war, and it overall came as a pretty big shock. That was really the first major change in territory in a few months. There's been a lot of skirmishes, and the lines have certainly shifted all across the front. But after the initial invasion in February, when Russia gobbled up substantial amounts of terrain, they've really turned this into more of like a slow, grinding approach all across the front, sort of focused on one area after another. Then in June, Russia took Severodonetsk in the east, which was really the last major territorial gain we've seen from them. One of the arguments of the need for an offensive is that Surovikin has to provide victories to Putin and to the Russian people to maintain support for the war. That's nothing new, nothing crazy. We're seeing the same on the Ukrainian side, really. And in fact, back in September and in August, there were some arguments that Zelensky was pushing these counteroffensives to happen too early simply because he wanted a victory to shore up Western support and that the Ukrainian military wasn't really ready for it quite yet. This sort of showing what's being accomplished, it can't be vague, it can't leave room for interpretation, and it has to be bold. Again, look at the Kharkiv push by Ukraine. It's very clear that Russia held that territory, and now Ukraine does. Debate all you want about how it happened, what went right, what went wrong. There's a clear result at the end. And it's reasonable to think that Surovikin is planning something very similar to that. It might be something symbolic, but certainly tangible, a show of force as a reminder to Russia and the rest of the world that they aren't done yet. Additionally, Surovikin has more troops available to him now than any Russian general has so far in this war. Getting a really solid feel for Russian public sentiment is a little bit challenging, but I think it's safe to say that not 100% of the Russian population supported the recent mobilization, and the population needs to be shown what this major step accomplished or what it's set to do. It's a very fair question for the Russian people to ask, what are you doing with this new resource of 300,000 troops? And simply not losing territory isn't really an option. Of course, that gets into what does an offensive look like? Is it a large mechanized force like we saw at the start of the war, or more a massing of fires followed by infantry attacks supported by armor like we've seen more as of late? The reason I bring that up is that we need to be mindful that a Russian offensive strike force might not look like the standard U.S. Army Brigade Combat Team or infantry division. We just have to be careful to not use U.S. or NATO readiness standards to predict when Russian forces are ready to kick off an attack. Then there's the aspect of the dragging out of this war. There are very valid arguments about how a protracted war benefits or hinders each side, and both Russia and Ukraine have very good reason to want to end this conflict sooner rather than later. As we're trying to look at this in this video from Russia's perspective, the attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure don't appear to have had the impact that were desired, at least not yet. It very well may as we get a few more months into winter, but at that point, you're kind of getting into the realms of guessing, which is not an ideal strategy in war. Now, if Ukraine was being pushed back all across the battlefield and the lights were out in cities all across the country, that might be room enough for talks to start. But right now, Ukraine has the battlefield momentum, and that carries a lot of weight. So, for the Russian attacks on civilian infrastructure to have maximum impact, they need to reverse the course of the war at the front. The ground across the east right now is still a little soft and muddy, but in the coming weeks, most likely, it'll firm up enough to allow armored and wheeled vehicles to pass across relatively easily. This is that potential winter window that people have talked about. Once the ground freezes and before it starts to thaw in the spring. So if there really is some big Russian push coming to secure a victory for Putin and the population, they probably have around 2 months from right now before the terrain makes it even more difficult. So overall, it makes sense that Russia would want a successful major offensive to kick off in the near future. That isn't rocket science, but let's talk about some of the challenges they might face trying to pull that off. Russia no longer has the element of surprise. I suppose they do tactically, right? They could mass forces in an area, and if they go undetected, surprise a portion of the Ukrainian line. But overall, Ukraine has been on an all-out war footing since February. Their defensive positions have been refined, tactics honed, and supply lines dialed into a level far beyond where they were at the start of the war. Ukraine is constantly on the lookout for Russian attacks and planning their defenses around where they're most vulnerable. And Russian troop movements can't be hidden behind the idea that it's just a training exercise anymore. When Russian forces consolidate in or around Ukraine now, in the middle of a war, that becomes a target of opportunity for long-range fires, not something Ukraine is going to sit around and hope doesn't materialize. Now, it sounds like Surovikin made quite a few changes since he took over in October, and he generally has the authority to execute the war as he sees fit. The withdrawal from Kherson, I think, is a great example of that. That was a smart military move. They were essentially pretty exposed there on the left bank, but a challenging political one. I mean, Russia had just annexed some of those territories, saying they're going to be Russia forever just a few weeks prior. That Surovikin had the authority or the approval to execute that maneuver in Kherson makes me think that he's got some flexibility on how to execute the war going forward. And if so, any new offensive he puts together likely won't follow the exact same pattern we've seen so far, but that doesn't mean it's by any means destined for success. There are other issues in the Russian military that are not going to be resolved by a quick change in senior leadership. Junior leaders, professional military soldiers that have been in the force for years have borne the brunt of this war, and quite a few have been lost, either killed, captured, or wounded. Any army needs those experienced soldiers to help integrate newly trained recruits into the force. 300,000 additional troops is a big number, but it's possible these newly trained recruits or reservists or some mix in between will be in the majority in some units rather than filling in gaps here and there. Another issue that's really surfaced during the war is the Russian ability to supply their troops at the forward line of attack. It's not that they aren't, just that it's sloppy and has generally lacked uniformity. To be clear here, Russia is able to supply their forces. If they weren't, this war would have been over a long time ago. It's keeping the force supplied on the move through contested territory that would be the potential issue here. It was pretty messy at the start of the conflict, especially in the north around Kyiv. Since then, Russia has cleaned up their logistical footprint a bit, but we're still seeing, especially with the Luhansk and Donetsk units in the east, a lack of resources available. Russia could very well have figured this all out, but it's the kind of thing that if they get it wrong, any forward momentum is going to be quickly voided. And we won't know for sure if Russia's really improved in this area until they're forced to do it under fire. And a quick note before we move on, this is just a stock photo of an ammo dump. It's a couple years old, I think. It's not from Ukraine. All right, so where might this potential attack come? And it's probably easier to talk about where it likely won't be. So let's start in the north and we'll move clockwise. All right, starting with Belarus. They've been making some noise as of late. I think I saw today, December 13th, that they were starting to do more drills near the border. But either way, there are Russian forces in Belarus, and this was used as an attack corridor during the initial invasion. Since then, Ukraine has built up pretty substantial defenses in the area. I wouldn't expect there to be too awful many Ukrainian troops manning those positions, at least compared to the east and the south. Now, ground assault here doesn't make a lot of sense to me. There's not a ton of Russian troops or equipment in Belarus today, and unless Putin is able to work some sort of magic on Lukashenko, I don't see the benefit of Belarus entering the conflict directly. Now, quick note on airborne forces, never say never, but the air defenses set up all across Ukraine would make any sort of large scale helicopter or airborne assault incredibly risky. So while that capability does exist within the Russian military, I'd probably put that towards the bottom of the list in terms of potential actions. Shifting to the northeast in the vicinity of Sumy and Kharkiv, this was another axis of advance at the start of the war and is a front that touches the Russian border. Sumy has been relatively quiet since April, at least compared to the rest of the front. Kharkiv was a grind for Russia right out the gate. That's where the 1st Guards Tank Army, sort of an elite unit within the Russian military, was pretty badly chewed up right at the start of the war. And of course, Kharkiv is generally where the Ukrainian army saw the most success in their September counteroffensive. Then you have Luhansk and Donetsk, where the fighting has never really slowed down. The lines have shifted a little bit over time. Big picture in this area is that both sides are generally fixed. Not so much that they can't maneuver out of the area, but there's a minimum force requirement on each side that if they go beneath, they risk losing their current positions. This includes the ongoing Battle of Bakhmut, and recent reports show that both sides continue to reinforce that fight. Further south, seems unlikely that a Russian attack would happen around Kherson. This is the area split by the Dnieper River that Russia recently ceded to Ukraine, at least on the West Bank. A river crossing under fire is no joke. It's really hard to pull off. And if the South was the preferred axis of attack for any future offensive, I would have expected Surovikin to reinforce and build up the foothold across the river rather than retrograde from it. Finally, we have the amphibious options in the Black Sea. This was a concern early in the war, but for the last few months now, really hasn't been top of mind. Russia still has a sizable naval force and regularly launches missiles from those ships into Ukraine from quite a distance out. But as Ukraine has demonstrated its ability to sink Russian warships, moving troop transports anywhere near the coast would be a pretty risky maneuver. Again, anything is possible, but an amphibious landing seems just about as likely as any sort of airborne assault. There's too many levels of hypotheticals here, but if Russia is planning an offensive and if they have the capacity to carry it out sometime in the next couple months, I would lean towards it happening in the Kharkiv region. Capturing that city opens the door for Russia to retake territory further south in some of the previously annexed areas, and it might also pull Ukrainian troops from the southern front in and around Kherson. Crimea is very important to Russia, and there's been a lot of talk of Ukraine wanting to take that back by force sometime in the near future. So an attack elsewhere on the line could pull Ukrainian resources from there, further delaying any potential offensive action on their part. So what do you think? Is Russia planning some big offensive in the next couple of weeks or months? Could they pull that off? And if they do, where is it going to take place? But that's all I got for now. I'll see y'all next time.